People in town laughed when the veteran started digging a giant hole in the middle of his cabin floor. But when the worst winter in decades buried the valley under 40 feet of snow, those same people would walk miles through a blizzard just to knock on his door. High in the Wind River Mountains, Ethan Brooks and his German Shepherd Atlas were preparing for a winter no one else believed was coming. After losing the person he loved most to a brutal storm, Ethan had learned one truth about the mountains. Comfort can disappear overnight. And while the town kept living like nothing would change, Ethan quietly buried 700 pounds of food beneath his cabin floor. Before the story begins, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching from today? I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. The sound came first. Steel biting into wood, then earth. Clang, scrape, thud. The rhythm echoed through the empty cabin as if the mountain itself were breathing beneath the floorboards. Outside, the Wind River Range stretched across Wyoming like a frozen ocean of stone. Early autumn light spilled over the ridges, turning the high peaks pale gold. The air was thin and cold already, carrying the smell of pine and distant snow. Inside the small cabin, Ethan Brooks drove the shovel down again. Clang! The blade struck packed dirt beneath the wooden floor he had ripped open that morning. Sweat ran down the back of his neck, despite the cold air drifting through the open door. Across the room, a large German shepherd watched him in silence. Atlas sat upright near the doorway, ears alert, amber eyes following every movement Ethan made. His thick black and tan coat caught the afternoon light. He looked less like a pet and more like a sentry guarding a lonely outpost. Ethan stopped for a moment, resting his hands on the shovel handle. The hole was already deep, nearly 4 feet down, and widening. He climbed out of it slowly, joints stiff, boots coated in dark soil. His beard had grown thicker since summer, streaked with early gray. The mountain wind pushed through the open door and brushed against the scar that ran along his jaw. Atlas stood and padded across the floor. The dog sniffed the edge of the pit, then looked up at Ethan. "You think it's deep enough?" Ethan muttered. Atlas tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he huffed quietly and sat down again. Ethan almost smiled. Outside, far down the slope, a gravel road wound toward the valley. From that distance, the town of Red Hollow looked like a scattering of toy houses beside the river. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys. Someone down there was probably watching. People in Red Hollow had been watching Ethan Brooks for months. The war veteran who moved into the abandoned cabin on the ridge. The quiet man who rarely came into town except to buy supplies. The man who talked more to his dog than to other people. And now the man who was tearing open his own floor. Earlier that afternoon, a pickup truck had slowed on the road below. 2 ranch hands had leaned out the window. One of them laughed when he saw the hole through the cabin floor. "Guess the war scrambled that guy's brain," the driver said. The other shook his head. "Digging a grave inside his own house," he replied. Their laughter drifted faintly up the hillside before the truck disappeared around the bend. Ethan heard it. He heard most things. Combat had trained his ears to pick up small sounds most people ignored. The creak of boots on gravel, the whisper of wind against tin roofing, the distant rumble of engines miles away. But he ignored the laughter the same way he ignored the rumors. People could think what they wanted. Atlas suddenly turned toward the door, ears stiff. A gust of wind rolled down the mountain. Cold. Colder than it should have been this early in the fall. Ethan stepped outside the cabin. The sky above the peaks was clear, but far to the north, a gray wall of clouds was forming over the mountains. Snow clouds. He knew the look. Winter was coming early. Again. He stared at the horizon for a long time. Then he turned back inside and climbed down into the hole. The shovel struck the earth again. Clang! This time the blade sank deeper. Dirt loosened. The pit slowly widened beneath the cabin floor. Atlas moved closer and lay down beside the opening, his chin resting near the edge. His eyes followed every movement Ethan made, never leaving him. "Not much longer," Ethan said quietly. The dog's tail thumped once against the wooden boards. 2 hours later, the hole was nearly 8 feet deep. Ethan climbed out slowly, muscles burning. The sun had dropped lower behind the mountains, throwing long shadows across the cabin. He walked outside again. Behind the cabin sat an old trailer filled with sacks. Potatoes, beans, flour, rice, salt, smoked meat wrapped in cloth. 700 pounds of food. He had hauled every pound of it up the mountain himself over the past 3 weeks. Trip after trip. Truck to cabin. Cabin to floor. Atlas had followed him every time. Now Ethan carried the first sack inside. Atlas stood and watched. The bag dropped into the pit with a dull thud. Another followed. Then another. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, the hole beneath the cabin was half full. Ethan climbed down inside and began stacking the food carefully along the packed earth walls. Each sack had its place. Each inch mattered. Atlas remained above, pacing slowly around the edge as if guarding the growing stockpile. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. By the time the stars appeared over the mountains, Ethan had lowered the final sack into the pit. 700 pounds. Enough to last months, maybe longer. He climbed out slowly and leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Atlas walked over and pressed his head gently against Ethan's leg. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's thick neck. "You remember last winter?" he said quietly. Atlas didn't move. He remembered. Dogs always did. Ethan looked down into the pit one last time. To anyone else, it might have looked like madness, burying food under the floor of a house. But Ethan Brooks had learned something the hard way. He had learned it in Afghanistan. He had learned it again in the mountains of Wyoming. Civilization was fragile. Supply lines broke. Roads closed. Storms came. And when they did, hope was never enough. Preparation was. He grabbed the wooden boards he had set aside earlier and began placing them back over the hole, one by one. Atlas watched as the bunker disappeared beneath the cabin floor. When the last board slid into place, the room looked almost normal again. Almost. Ethan sank into a chair beside the table. Atlas lay down near the door. The wind outside began to rise, rattling the cabin windows. Somewhere far above the ridge, the first snow of the season was already falling. And down in the valley, the people of Red Hollow were still laughing about the man on the mountain. The man burying food beneath his floor. None of them knew what the coming winter would bring. But Ethan Brooks did. And that was why he had buried 700 pounds of food under his cabin. Atlas lifted his head and looked toward the dark mountains. Then he looked back at Ethan. The long winter was coming. And this time, they would be ready. The next morning, the mountain air carried a sharp bite that hadn't been there the week before. Frost coated the tall grass around the cabin, and thin ice clung to the edges of a rusted water trough beside the barn.
Ethan Brooks stepped out onto the porch with a mug of black coffee in his hand. Atlas followed, his paws quiet against the wooden boards. They both looked toward the northern ridgeline. Snow clouds.
Not yet, but close. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee and listened. The mountains were never silent if you knew how to listen. Wind moving through pine branches, ravens calling somewhere above the valley, the distant creak of frozen trees shifting in the cold. Atlas suddenly stiffened. A vehicle. The faint growl of an engine drifted up the dirt road that wound toward the cabin. Ethan heard it too. A minute later, a pickup truck appeared around the bend and rolled slowly toward the clearing. Dust followed behind it in a lazy cloud. The truck door slammed. A tall man stepped out. Even from the porch, Ethan recognized him immediately. Calvin Mercer, the largest cattle rancher in the valley. Mercer wore a heavy denim jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. He walked with the easy confidence of someone used to owning most of the land around him. He glanced once at the cabin. Then his eyes moved to the trailer parked beside the barn. The trailer was stacked with more supplies: flour, salt, canned vegetables. Atlas moved forward and stood at the edge of the porch, not barking, just watching. Mercer approached slowly, hands resting on his belt. "Morning, Brooks," he said. Ethan nodded once. "Morning." Mercer looked past him into the cabin. His gaze settled briefly on the newly repaired floorboards. "So it's true," Mercer said. "What is?" "You're burying food under your house." Ethan didn't answer. Mercer chuckled softly. "People in town are talking." "That's so?" "Oh yeah," Mercer said. "You become something of a local legend." Atlas stepped down from the porch and walked closer to Ethan's side. The rancher noticed. "Good-looking dog," Mercer said. Atlas stared at him without moving. "German Shepherd?" Ethan nodded. "Name's Atlas." Mercer studied the dog for a moment. "Looks like he could take down a wolf." "He could." Mercer smiled faintly. Then he looked back toward the trailer. "You planning to feed the entire county this winter?" "No," Ethan said calmly. "Just yourself?" "Maybe." Mercer laughed. "You know what we call that in town?" Ethan waited. "Paranoia." A cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, rattling the loose tin sheet on the old barn roof. Mercer leaned against the truck door and continued. "You realize this valley hasn't had a bad winter in years." "Winters don't follow schedules," Ethan said. Mercer waved a dismissive hand. "We've got supply trucks coming through every week. Highways maintained year-round." Ethan remained quiet. Mercer's voice carried a tone of amusement now. "You're acting like we're back in the 1800s. Ethan finally met the rancher's eyes. "Storms don't care what century it is." For a moment, Mercer said nothing. Then he laughed again. "You really believe that?" Ethan shrugged. "I believe in being ready." Mercer looked back toward the valley below. His ranch spread across thousands of acres down there, rolling fields dotted with cattle and barns. "I've got 30,000 head of cattle," Mercer said. "You think I'd let a little snow scare me?" Atlas let out a low breath. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's neck. "Snow doesn't scare me either," Ethan said quietly. Mercer studied him for a long moment. There was something in the veteran's eyes that made the rancher slightly uncomfortable. Not fear, not anger, just certainty. Mercer pushed away from the truck. "Well," he said, adjusting his hat, "good luck with your underground pantry." He opened the truck door.
Town's gonna have a good laugh about this one. Ethan didn't respond. The truck engine started. Gravel crunched as Mercer turned the vehicle around and headed back down the mountain road. The dust cloud slowly settled behind him. Atlas watched until the truck disappeared over the ridge. Then he turned and walked toward the trailer. Ethan followed. They began unloading more supplies.
Another sack of potatoes, 2 crates of canned beans, a box of salt. Trip after trip into the cabin. Atlas carried smaller bundles tied with rope, gripping them carefully in his jaws. By noon, the bunker beneath the cabin floor held even more food. Ethan climbed down into the pit again and stacked the supplies neatly along the walls. Atlas peered over the edge, watching. "Not bad," Ethan murmured. Atlas wagged his tail once. Above them, the sky continued to darken. Clouds gathered over the mountains like a slow-moving wall. By late afternoon, the first snowflakes began to drift down. Tiny, almost harmless. Ethan stood outside the cabin and watched them fall. Most people in the valley would see beauty in that first snow. A fresh start, a peaceful winter. Ethan saw something else. A warning. He had learned that lesson far from Wyoming, in places where supply lines vanished overnight, where storms turned roads into graves, where the difference between survival and death was measured in preparation. Atlas walked up beside him and sat. The snowflakes settled on the dog's thick fur and melted slowly. Ethan scratched behind Atlas's ear. "They think we're crazy," he said. Atlas looked up at him. "Maybe we are." The dog's tail thumped softly against the snow-covered ground. Ethan turned back toward the cabin. There was still work to do. Inside the bunker, the food had to be sealed against moisture. The floorboards needed to be reinforced, and the woodpile outside had to be doubled before the deep cold arrived. The snow continued falling, slowly, quietly. High above the valley, winter had begun its long descent. And in the town below, the people of Red Hollow were still laughing about the veteran on the mountain, the man who buried food beneath his cabin floor. None of them understood why he worked so hard. None of them remembered what the mountains could do. But Ethan Brooks did. Atlas did too. And together, they kept preparing. The first snow didn't stay long. By midday the next day, sunlight broke through the clouds and melted most of it away. Water dripped steadily from the cabin roof, tapping against the metal bucket beside the porch. To most people in Red Hollow, the storm had already become a memory. But Ethan Brooks didn't trust memories. He trusted patterns. Atlas followed him across the clearing as Ethan split another stack of firewood beside the barn. Each swing of the axe echoed through the cold mountain air. Crack! Another log split clean in two. Atlas carried the pieces to the growing pile beside the cabin wall, dropping them carefully near the door. They worked that way for hours, man and dog. Quiet, efficient. But as the afternoon light faded across the valley, Ethan's eyes drifted toward the road again. The road that curved down the mountain. The same road Lily had driven a year ago. The memory didn't arrive gently. It never did. It came like a storm. One moment Ethan was stacking wood, the next he was somewhere else entirely. Another winter. Another sky. Gray clouds rolling over the Wind River peaks. Lily Brooks stood inside the cabin doorway, pulling on her coat. "You need medicine," she said softly. "I'm fine," Ethan had answered. "You haven't slept in 2 days." Ethan sat at the table, hands shaking slightly. The nightmares had been bad that week. Afghanistan had a way of coming back when the nights got too quiet. Lily knelt in front of him. "You fought a war," she said, "but you're home now." Ethan remembered the warmth of her hand against his cheek. "I'll drive down to town," she told him. "I'll be back before dark." Atlas had been younger then, smaller, still learning the mountain. The dog followed Lily out to the truck. Ethan stepped onto the porch. "You sure about this?" he asked. Lily smiled. "It's just a snowstorm, Ethan." The wind picked up as she climbed into the truck. Atlas barked once. Ethan still remembered the sound of the engine fading down the mountain road. And then the snow came. Not the gentle snowfall people like to watch through cabin windows. This storm was different. The wind roared through the valley like an animal. Snow buried the road within hours. Trees bent under the weight of ice. Ethan waited that first night by the window. By the second night, worry had turned into fear. By the third morning, he couldn't wait anymore. Atlas was the one who found the scent. The dog led him down the mountain through chest-deep snow, nose low to the ground. Step by step, mile after mile, until they reached the bend in the road. The truck was barely visible, half buried beneath a drift of frozen snow. Ethan remembered digging with his bare hands, Atlas clawing beside him, the metal door finally appearing through the ice. Inside the truck, Lily sat behind the wheel, her hands still wrapped around the steering wheel, her eyes closed. She looked peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep while waiting for the storm to pass. But the storm hadn't passed, and Lily never woke up. The memory faded slowly. The sound of the axe returned. Crack! The log split. Ethan lowered the axe and leaned against the woodpile, breathing heavily. Atlas walked over and pressed his head against Ethan's leg. The dog always knew when the memories came. Ethan rested his hand on Atlas's back. "You remember her too," he murmured. Atlas let out a soft breath. The wind moved through the pine trees above them. Cold. Colder than it should have been this early in the season. Ethan looked toward the mountains again. The northern sky had turned darker. Snow clouds were forming again. Bigger this time. He wiped sweat from his forehead and picked up the axe. They still had work to do. Inside the cabin, the bunker needed insulation along the walls. Outside, the woodpile had to grow twice as large, and the barn roof still needed repairs before the heavy snow came. Atlas trotted beside him as they walked toward the barn. The old structure leaned slightly to one side, its wood darkened by decades of wind and snow. Ethan climbed the ladder and began hammering new boards across the weakest beams. Atlas waited below, watching, guarding. The sky continued to darken. By the time Ethan climbed down from the ladder, the first flakes had started falling again. Larger now, slower. Atlas tilted his head upward, watching the snow drift through the air. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. A cold feeling settled deep in his chest, the kind of feeling that came from experience. The kind that couldn't be explained to people who had never watched a storm swallow an entire valley. He placed a hand on Atlas's shoulder. "This one's going to be worse," he said quietly. Atlas didn't move. The snow continued falling. And somewhere, high above the Wind River Range, the next storm was already gathering strength. By the time the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks, the clearing around Ethan Brooks's cabin had turned white. Snow gathered along the porch railing. The wind pushed thin waves of powder across the frozen ground like drifting sand. Inside the cabin,
The fire crackled steadily in the iron stove. Atlas lay stretched near the doorway, his ears twitching each time the wind rattled the windows. Ethan sat at the table with a pencil and a small, weathered notebook. Numbers covered the page. Wood, water, salt, beans, potatoes, rice. He ran a hand through his beard and studied the figures again. 700 pounds of food below the floor. Nearly 2 cords of firewood stacked outside. Barrels of melted snow stored along the wall. Still not enough. Not yet. Atlas lifted his head as Ethan stood and walked toward the door. Cold air rushed inside the moment he opened it. Night had fallen quickly in the mountains. The sky above the ridge glowed faintly with starlight, but clouds still moved like shadows across the peaks. The temperature had already dropped far below freezing. Ethan grabbed another armload of firewood from the pile and carried it inside. Atlas followed him out. The dog moved across the clearing with slow, careful steps, sniffing the wind. Ethan noticed the tension in Atlas's posture. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Atlas stared toward the tree line. Nothing moved there, only snow sliding from branches. Still, the dog remained alert. Animals sense storms long before people did. Ethan trusted Atlas more than any weather forecast. He set the wood beside the stove and stepped back outside again. The wind had grown stronger. The barn door creaked loudly in the darkness. Ethan crossed the clearing and pushed it shut, fastening the heavy latch. Inside the barn, the smell of old hay and frozen earth filled the air. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the wooden walls. Ethan moved slowly through the shadows, checking the roof beams he had repaired earlier. The boards held steady. Good. He turned toward the corner where a small stack of hunting supplies rested against the wall. Rope, lantern, 2 steel traps, and the old rifle leaning against a wooden crate. Atlas padded into the barn behind him. The dog sniffed along the ground, then suddenly stopped. His ears rose. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. For a moment he saw nothing. Then the shape moved. A dark figure slipped silently between the trees just beyond the barn. A wolf. Thin. Hungry. Winter was already tightening its grip on the mountain. The wolf stared at them for a long moment, its breath visible in the freezing air. Atlas stepped forward. The growl deepened. The wolf hesitated. Then it vanished back into the trees. Ethan watched the empty darkness for several seconds. "Won't be the last," he murmured. Atlas relaxed slightly, but kept his eyes fixed on the forest. Animals felt winter sooner than humans. They felt hunger coming. Ethan knelt and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "We'll manage," he said. They walked back toward the cabin. The wind howled louder now, pushing snow across the clearing in long, sweeping gusts. Inside the cabin, Ethan added more logs to the fire. Flames leaped higher inside the stove. Atlas circled twice near the door before settling down again. Ethan sat at the table once more and studied the notebook. He flipped to another page. A rough sketch of the valley. Red hollow at the center. Ranches spread along the river. The road that climbed toward the cabin. He marked the locations carefully, not because he planned to visit them, because he knew something the rest of the valley didn't. When storms like this came early, they rarely came alone. And when the roads closed, everything changed. He remembered Afghanistan again. Convoys stranded in desert storms. Supply lines cut for weeks. Men rationing food and water while waiting for rescue that might never come. The mountains worked the same way. Different terrain, same lesson.
Depend on the wrong system, and you didn't last long. Atlas lifted his head again. The wind outside had shifted. Snow slammed harder against the cabin walls now. The storm was building faster than expected. Ethan stood and walked to the window. Visibility had already dropped. The road leading down the mountain was barely visible through the snow. If the storm continued through the night, it would bury the road completely by morning. He closed the curtain. Atlas watched him. "You hear it too," Ethan said quietly. The dog thumped his tail once. Ethan walked to the trap door hidden beneath the rug. He pulled the rug aside and lifted the reinforced wooden panel. Cold air drifted up from the bunker below. Atlas stepped closer and peered into the darkness. Rows of carefully stacked sacks lined the walls. 700 pounds of food. Ethan climbed down the ladder. The small underground room smelled of earth and dry grain. He ran his hand along the stacked supplies, checking the seals on the bags. Everything dry, everything safe. For now. He climbed back up and sealed the trapdoor again. Atlas moved aside as the rug slid back into place. The wind roared louder outside. Somewhere in the forest, a branch snapped under the weight of snow. Ethan sat beside the stove and stared into the fire. Atlas rested his head on Ethan's boot. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them slept for a long time. Outside the cabin, the storm continued to grow. And far down in the valley, the people of Red Hollow still believed winter would pass like it always had. They still believed the roads would stay open, that the trucks would keep coming, that the mountains would behave. But Ethan Brooks had seen enough winters and enough wars to know better. The war against winter had already begun, and he intended to win it. Morning came quietly to the mountains. The storm that had howled through the night had moved east, leaving the Wind River Range buried beneath a clean, white blanket of snow. The sky above the peaks glowed pale blue, and sunlight reflected off the drifts so brightly it hurt the eyes. Ethan Brooks stepped out onto the porch and took a long breath. The cold cut straight through his lungs. Atlas followed him into the clearing, snow crunching beneath his paws. The road down the mountain had vanished beneath nearly 2 feet of powder. Ethan studied it carefully. The road wasn't gone, just sleeping. One strong storm could turn it into something far worse. Atlas trotted ahead, pushing his nose into the snowbanks. His tail moved slowly, leaving long, sweeping marks in the powder. Ethan walked toward the woodpile. They had burned through more firewood than he expected during the night storm. That meant one thing: more work. He picked up the axe. Atlas circled the clearing, occasionally glancing toward the tree line. The forest remained quiet. Too quiet. An hour later, Ethan heard the distant rumble of an engine. Atlas froze. Both of them turned toward the road. A snowplow truck appeared slowly through the drifts below, clearing a narrow path along the mountain road. Behind it, a pickup followed closely. The truck stopped near the base of the slope. A moment later, a man stepped out. Even from that distance, Ethan recognized the shape of his wide hat. Calvin Mercer again. The rancher climbed into the pickup and drove slowly up the newly cleared road toward the cabin. Atlas stood beside Ethan, silent. The truck rolled to a stop in the clearing. Mercer stepped out and looked around at the snow-covered landscape. "Well," he said with a grin, "looks like winter finally showed up." Ethan leaned the axe against the woodpile. "It always does." Mercer chuckled. "You worried about your bunker yet?" Ethan said nothing. Mercer walked around the clearing, studying the stacked firewood, the barn repairs, and the snow piled along the cabin walls. "You've been busy." "Preparing?" Mercer nodded slowly. "You know the plow came through this morning." I saw. Highway's still open, Mercer said. Supply trucks will be rolling through town by tonight. Atlas watched the rancher carefully. Mercer noticed the dog's stare. He doesn't like me much, does he? He's careful. Mercer laughed. Aren't we all? He kicked a small clump of snow with his boot. You should come down to town tonight, Mercer said. People are gathering at the diner. First big snow of the year. Everyone's celebrating. Celebrating? Yeah, Mercer said. Winter festival. Happens every year. Ethan looked toward the mountains. The northern sky still carried a faint gray line above the peaks. Storm clouds. Not gone, just waiting. You go ahead, Ethan said. Mercer shook his head with a smile. You mountain types are all the same. He opened the truck door. But don't worry, Brooks, he added. This valley's seen worse winters than this. The engine started again. Mercer drove back down the road, the truck disappearing behind the trees. Atlas watched until the sound faded. Then he turned to Ethan. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. Let them celebrate, he said quietly. The rest of the day passed slowly. They worked together in silence. Ethan reinforced the barn doors with additional boards. Atlas carried tools from the cabin and watched the forest carefully. By late afternoon, the sun had begun to sink behind the peaks again. The cold returned quickly. Ethan stepped inside the cabin and lit the stove. Atlas curled near the door. For a moment, the world felt calm. But the mountains never stayed calm for long. That evening, far below the cabin, the lights of Red Hollow flickered on across the valley. Inside the diner, people laughed and talked over hot coffee and fresh pie. The snowplow driver told stories about the morning storm. Ranchers joked about Ethan Brooks and his buried food. He's storing enough supplies to survive the apocalypse, one man laughed. Calvin Mercer leaned back in his chair. Man's preparing for the wrong war, he said. Outside the diner window, snow drifted quietly through the streetlights. The highway trucks continued to roll into town. Deliveries arrived. Shelves in the small grocery store stayed full. Everything felt normal, comfortable, safe. But high above the valley, Ethan Brooks stood outside his cabin and watched the sky again. Atlas stood beside him. The dog's ears rose slowly. The wind had shifted. The gray line above the mountains had grown thicker. Ethan felt the change immediately. The kind of change most people missed. The kind soldiers learned to recognize before things went wrong. Another storm was coming. Bigger than the last one. He knelt beside Atlas. You feel it too, don't you? Atlas stared toward the mountains. The wind carried a low, distant sound across the ridges. A sound like the first breath of a long winter. Down in Red Hollow, people still laughed and celebrated. But up on the mountain, Ethan Brooks knew the truth. Comfort made people forget. And the mountains never forgot anything. The next storm arrived 2 days later. It began before sunrise. Ethan woke to a sound that felt familiar deep in his bones. The low, steady roar of wind rolling down from the peaks. The cabin walls creaked as the storm pressed against them, and snow rattled against the windows like handfuls of sand. Atlas was already awake. The dog stood near the door, ears stiff, body tense. Ethan sat up slowly in the narrow bed beside the stove. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving the room dim and cold. For a moment, he listened. Wind. Snow. The deep groaning sound of trees bending somewhere beyond the clearing. Atlas turned his head and looked at him. Yeah,
Ethan murmured quietly. I hear it too. He pulled on his coat and boots and walked to the window. Outside, the world had disappeared. The storm swallowed everything beyond 20 feet. Snow blasted sideways through the air, driven by powerful gusts racing down the mountain slopes. The road down the ridge was gone again, completely buried. Ethan opened the cabin door just a few inches. The wind shoved it hard enough to make the hinges scream. Cold air exploded into the room. Atlas stepped forward, but stopped at the threshold, squinting against the storm. Ethan closed the door again. Not today, he said. They spent the morning inside. The storm didn't weaken. By noon, the snow had piled halfway up the porch railing. The wind pushed long waves of powder across the clearing, reshaping the drifts minute by minute. Ethan checked the bunker again. The food remained dry. The trap door sealed tightly.
Atlas followed him down the ladder and sniffed the stacked sacks along the walls. 700 pounds. Enough to survive. But Ethan wasn't worried about himself. He climbed back into the cabin and lit another log in the stove. Outside, the storm kept growing. By afternoon, the power lines down in the valley snapped under the weight of ice. In Red Hollow, the lights flickered once, then went dark. Inside the grocery store, people stared at empty cash registers and silent refrigerators. The snowplow driver tried to start his truck again. The engine turned once, twice, then died. On the highway beyond the valley, 3 supply trucks slid sideways across an icy stretch of road and blocked both lanes. The radio tower above town lost its signal. The storm swallowed everything. Back on the mountain, Ethan listened to the wind as evening approached. The sound reminded him of Afghanistan. Sandstorms that turned midday into darkness. Convoys stranded for days. Men trapped inside armored trucks waiting for visibility that never returned. Storms didn't care about plans. They didn't care about schedules. And they didn't care about people who believed the world would stay comfortable. Atlas stood suddenly. The dog walked to the door again and sniffed the air. Ethan watched him. What is it? Atlas didn't bark. He simply listened. Then a faint sound reached Ethan through the storm. A distant rumble. Engines. More than one. Ethan opened the door again, pushing hard against the wind. Through the white chaos, he saw shapes moving slowly down the road. Headlights. Several trucks crawling toward the valley. The last supply convoy. They were trying to reach Red Hollow before the road vanished completely. But the storm was already too strong. Even from the cabin, Ethan could see the first truck slide sideways across the narrow mountain curve. The driver fought the wheel. The tires spun uselessly against the ice. Then the second truck behind it jackknifed. The entire convoy stopped. The wind howled louder. Snow buried the road around them. Within minutes, the trucks became silent shapes inside the storm. Ethan watched for a long moment. Then he closed the door. Atlas looked up at him. They won't make it through, Ethan said quietly. The dog lowered his head. Evening settled slowly over the mountain. The storm continued without pause. Down in Red Hollow, the diner lights stayed dark. Homes grew colder. People lit candles and lanterns. And for the first time since the valley had been settled, the supply road into town was completely gone. No trucks, no deliveries, no way in, no way out. Ethan sat beside the stove as the fire cracked softly in the quiet cabin. Atlas lay at his feet. Outside, the storm kept falling. Hour after hour, day after day. The snow never stopped. And slowly, quietly, the people of Red Hollow began to realize something none of them had believed before. This winter wasn't ending anytime soon. The storm did not stop the next day, or the day after that. Snow kept falling across the Wind River Valley in slow, relentless waves. The plow trucks that once cleared the highway sat frozen beside the road, buried beneath drifts that reached their windows. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice. The grocery store shelves emptied within 3 days. The diner served its last hot meal before the propane tanks ran dry. By the end of the week, Red Hollow had become something it had never been before. Cut off. Trapped beneath winter. High above the valley, Ethan Brooks noticed the change long before anyone said it out loud. He saw it in the silence of the mountain. The road remained invisible beneath nearly 6 feet of snow now. Even the tall fence posts that marked its edges had disappeared. Atlas moved carefully through the clearing outside the cabin, leaving narrow trails in the deep powder. Ethan followed with a shovel, clearing a path from the porch to the woodpile. The air was bitter cold, the kind that burned inside the lungs. Atlas stopped suddenly. His ears lifted. Ethan paused with the shovel. The wind carried something faint through the trees. A sound. Not the howl of wind, not the creak of branches. Footsteps. Slow. Dragging. Atlas moved toward the edge of the clearing. Ethan set the shovel down and followed. Through the falling snow, a figure appeared between the trees. A woman. She struggled forward, each step sinking deep into the snow. Behind her came 2 small shapes. Children. The woman reached the edge of the clearing and nearly collapsed. Ethan moved quickly across the snow and caught her arm before she fell. Her coat was thin and covered in frost. Her face looked pale beneath a layer of windburn. "Please," she whispered. Atlas approached slowly, sniffing the air. The children stood a few feet away, shaking with cold. A little boy clutched his sister's hand tightly. Ethan recognized the woman. Grace Whitaker. She lived near the river on the east side of town. "What are you doing up here?" Ethan asked quietly. Grace tried to catch her breath. We ran out," she said. Her voice cracked. "No food left in the house." Ethan glanced at the children. Their cheeks were hollow. Their eyes carried the tired look he had seen in too many places before. Atlas stepped closer to the children. The little girl flinched at first. Then Atlas gently lowered his head and nudged her mitten with his nose. She hesitated. Then she reached out and touched the dog's fur. Atlas stayed perfectly still. Ethan looked back at Grace. "You walked all the way up here?" Grace nodded weakly. "I heard people say you had supplies." The wind pushed snow across the clearing again. Ethan stood quietly for several seconds. The decision sat heavy in his chest. Atlas turned his head and looked at him. Ethan sighed. "Come inside," he said. Grace nearly collapsed with relief. Inside the cabin, the fire burned warm inside the stove. The children sat near the heat while Ethan poured hot water into metal cups. Atlas lay beside them, watching carefully. Grace wrapped her hands around the cup, her fingers trembling. "I didn't know where else to go," she said softly. Ethan nodded once. Then he walked to the rug in the center of the floor. He pulled it aside. Grace watched silently as Ethan lifted the wooden trapdoor. Cold air rose from the bunker beneath the cabin. Ethan climbed down the ladder. Rows of sacks lined the underground walls. 700 pounds. He lifted one of the smaller bags and carried it back up. Grace stared at the food as if it were something unreal. Ethan set the bag on the table. "Take it," he said. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I can't repay." "Feed the kids," Ethan interrupted gently. The boy stared at the sack. "Is that potatoes?" he asked quietly. Ethan nodded. Atlas wagged his tail slowly. Grace wiped her eyes. "You're saving our lives," she said. Ethan shook his head. "Just helping you through the storm." Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls. Grace and the children stayed for an hour before preparing to leave. Ethan packed another small bundle of dried beans and smoked meat into a cloth bag. Atlas walked with them to the edge of the clearing. The dog watched until their figures disappeared between the trees. Then he turned back toward the cabin. Ethan stood on the porch, staring down the invisible road toward the valley. He knew what would happen next. News traveled quickly in a small town. Someone would ask Grace where she found food. Grace would tell them. And soon the people of Red Hollow would remember the man on the mountain. The man who buried 700 pounds of food beneath his cabin floor. Ethan looked down at Atlas. The dog met his eyes. "You know what this means," Ethan said quietly. Atlas's tail moved once. Snow continued falling across the Wind River Range, and somewhere in the valley below, another hungry family was already wondering if the road to Ethan Brooks's cabin might still be passable. The next morning the wind had calmed. Not gone, just quieter. A thin gray sky stretched across the mountains, and the cold sat heavy over the valley like a lid. Ethan stepped outside the cabin with Atlas beside him. The clearing looked different now. The snow reached nearly to Ethan's knees, and the trail Grace Whitaker had left the night before had already faded beneath new drifts. Atlas walked to the edge of the clearing and sniffed the air. He didn't need to wait long. The sound came again. Footsteps. This time, there were more of them. Ethan didn't move. He simply stood on the porch and waited. A few minutes later, 3 figures appeared through the trees. A man carrying a small pack. Behind him walked an older woman wrapped in blankets, and a boy, maybe 10 years old, struggling to keep up. Atlas moved closer to Ethan's side. The man raised one hand as they reached the clearing. "Mr. Brooks?" he called. Ethan nodded once. The man looked exhausted. "Grace Whitaker said we might find help up here." Ethan studied them for a moment. The man's coat was torn along one sleeve. The boy's boots were covered in frost. The older woman leaned heavily on a wooden stick as she walked. Atlas approached the boy first. The boy froze. Atlas sniffed his gloves carefully. Then the dog wagged his tail. The boy's shoulders relaxed. "His name's Atlas," Ethan said. The boy smiled weakly. Ethan stepped aside. "Come inside." Inside the cabin, the fire warmed the small room quickly. Steam rose from the cups as Ethan poured hot water again. The visitors didn't speak much. They simply sat close to the stove and let their hands thaw. The older woman closed her eyes for a moment. The boy stared at Atlas as the dog lay quietly beside the door. Finally, the man spoke. "We tried the grocery store first," he said. "But everything's gone." Ethan nodded. The man continued. "Then we heard people talking in town." "Talking about what?" Ethan asked. "About the veteran on the mountain." Atlas lifted his head slightly. The man looked embarrassed. "About the man who buried food under his floor." Ethan said nothing. The man lowered his voice.
I didn't believe it at first. Ethan stood slowly and walked to the rug again. Atlas rose and followed him. The man watched as Ethan pulled the rug aside. The trap door lifted. Cold air rose from the bunker once more. When Ethan climbed back up the ladder, he carried 2 sacks, one of potatoes, one of beans. The boy's eyes widened. "You really had food all this time?" he whispered. Ethan placed the sacks on the table. "Take what you need." The man stared at the food. "I can't accept this," he said quietly. "You can," Ethan replied. Atlas sat beside the boy, his tail moving slowly across the wooden floor. The boy rested a hand on the dog's back. Outside, the snow began falling again. By the time the visitors left the cabin, the sky had grown darker. Atlas walked them halfway down the trail before returning to Ethan's side. Ethan stood in the doorway long after they disappeared. He knew what would happen next. Word spread faster than snow. That evening, a lantern appeared at the edge of the trees. Then another. By the following morning, 3 families had climbed the mountain. Ethan gave them food. The next day, 5 more arrived. Some brought small things in exchange: a jar of honey, a bag of dried corn, a box of matches. Others brought nothing but empty hands. Ethan gave them food anyway. Atlas watched every person who stepped into the cabin. The dog seemed to know who was frightened, who was desperate, who meant no harm.
Sometimes Atlas sat beside the children as they ate. Other times he stood near the door, guarding the room like a silent soldier. Days turned into weeks. The bunker beneath the cabin slowly changed. 700 pounds became 600. 600 became 5. Ethan marked the numbers in his notebook each night. The fire burned constantly now. Outside, the storm never fully stopped. Snow came in waves across the valley. The road down the mountain remained buried. And Red Hollow grew quieter with each passing week. One evening, after the last family had left the cabin, Ethan opened the trapdoor again. Atlas followed him down the ladder. The underground room looked different now. Empty spaces appeared along the walls where sacks once stood. Ethan counted the remaining stacks. 300 pounds left. Atlas sat beside him. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's head. "You're keeping track too, aren't you?" he murmured. Atlas leaned gently against him. Ethan climbed back into the cabin and sealed the trapdoor. The wind outside had begun to rise again. Another storm was forming. He sat beside the fire, flipping through the pages of his notebook. More numbers, more calculations. Atlas lay beside his chair. After a long silence, Ethan closed the notebook. "Half gone," he said quietly. Atlas lifted his head. Ethan stared into the fire. The mountain outside remained silent and endless. And somewhere in the valley below, more people were already beginning the long walk toward the only cabin that still had food. The cabin where the veteran and his dog lived. The place everyone in Red Hollow now called the same thing: the mountain's last pantry. The name spread through the valley the way snow spread across the mountains. Quietly at first, then everywhere at once. People spoke it in whispers beside wood stoves and candlelight. The veteran on the ridge. The man with food beneath his floor. The mountain's last pantry. Ethan Brooks never used the name himself, but he felt the weight of it every time someone knocked on his cabin door. By mid-February, the snow had grown so deep that the trail from the valley looked more like a tunnel carved through white walls. Atlas stood watch near the edge of the clearing each morning. The dog had learned the pattern. Footsteps meant visitors. Visitors meant hunger. And hunger meant another sack leaving the bunker. That morning the wind had finally calmed. For the first time in weeks, the sky above the Wind River peaks opened into a pale blue. Sunlight spilled across the clearing and turned the snow bright enough to sting the eyes. Ethan stepped onto the porch and stretched his stiff shoulders. Atlas padded beside him. The cold had grown worse over the past month. The kind of cold that crept through walls and settled into bone. Inside the cabin, the fire never stopped burning. Outside, the snowdrifts now stood taller than the fence posts around the barn. Ethan had stopped trying to clear the entire yard. He only maintained the path from the door to the woodpile. Anything else was pointless. Atlas suddenly stopped walking. His ears lifted. Ethan saw it too. Movement along the trail. A single figure climbed slowly through the snow. Tall, broad shoulders. The man moved carefully, pushing forward with a long wooden stick. Atlas walked halfway down the path and waited. Ethan remained on the porch. The man reached the clearing a few minutes later. Even beneath the heavy coat and snow-covered hat, Ethan recognized him. Calvin Mercer, the rancher who once laughed at the idea of burying food. Mercer looked older now. The storm had taken something out of him. His beard had grown thick and uneven, and deep lines marked his face. He stopped a few feet from the porch. Atlas stood between the two men. Mercer looked down at the dog. "He remembers me," he said quietly. Atlas didn't move. Ethan stepped forward. "What brings you up here?" Mercer hesitated. For a moment, the proud rancher looked as if he might turn around and walk back into the snow. But the wind shifted behind him, and the sound of the empty valley followed. "My cattle are gone," Mercer said finally. Ethan said nothing. "Storm buried half the herd the first week," Mercer continued. "The rest starved." He looked down at the snow. "I tried hauling hay from the lower fields, but the roads disappeared." The rancher's voice grew quieter. "I lost everything." Atlas stepped aside slightly. Mercer climbed the last few steps toward the porch. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them carried months of memory. The laughter, the mocking words. Nobody buries food in America. Mercer finally lifted his eyes. "My grandchildren are hungry." The sentence hung in the cold air. Atlas looked up at Ethan. Ethan turned slowly and walked back inside the cabin. Mercer remained standing in the doorway. Atlas followed Ethan across the floor. The rug in the center of the room moved aside again. The trapdoor opened. Mercer watched as Ethan climbed down the ladder. When he returned, he carried 2 sacks. Potatoes. Beans. Ethan placed them on the table. Mercer stared at them as if they were gold. "I don't deserve this," the rancher said quietly. Ethan met his eyes. "Kids do." Mercer lowered his head. Atlas walked closer and sniffed the rancher's coat. The dog seemed to understand something that words couldn't explain. Mercer lifted one of the sacks slowly. "I'll repay you when the roads open," he said. Ethan shook his head. "Just keep them warm." Mercer nodded once. Then he turned and stepped back into the snow. Atlas walked with him to the edge of the clearing. The rancher paused there and looked back toward the cabin. For the first time since Ethan had known him, Calvin Mercer looked small against the vast mountains. Then he disappeared into the white forest. Atlas returned to the porch. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching the empty trail. The sun had already begun to fade behind the peaks again. Another cold night was coming. Inside the cabin, Ethan lifted the trapdoor once more and climbed into the bunker. Atlas followed him down. The underground room felt colder than before. More empty spaces had appeared along the walls. Ethan counted the sacks again. 200 pounds left. He rested his hand against the rough dirt wall. "Not much," he murmured. Atlas sat beside him. The dog leaned against Ethan's shoulder. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Above them, the cabin creaked softly as the wind returned. Ethan climbed back up the ladder and sealed the trapdoor again. He sat beside the stove and stared into the fire. Atlas lay at his feet. Outside, night settled slowly over the Wind River Range. And for the first time since the storm began, Ethan Brooks realized something he hadn't allowed himself to think before. Winter was only halfway over. The thought stayed with him through the night. It followed him into the quiet morning and lingered in the cold air each time he stepped outside the cabin. Atlas noticed the change in him. Dogs always did. The storm returned the next day with another wave of heavy snow, sealing the mountain trails once again. Visitors still came, though fewer now. The journey up the ridge had become dangerous even for the strongest men in Red Hollow. But hunger was stronger than fear. That week, 3 more families climbed the mountain. Ethan gave them food. Every time the trapdoor opened, Atlas followed him into the bunker and watched the rows of sacks grow thinner. 200 pounds. Then 180. Then 160. Ethan kept writing the numbers in his notebook each night, his pencil scratching softly beside the fire. But there was one number he never wrote down: his own meals. The first time he skipped dinner, it didn't matter. The second time, he told himself it was temporary. The third time, Atlas noticed. The dog lifted his head from the floor and watched Ethan push his bowl aside. "You eat," Ethan told him gently, sliding the food closer. Atlas hesitated. Then he obeyed. The next morning, Ethan felt the weakness in his legs when he stood. Just a little, nothing serious. He had known worse in the desert years ago. Outside, the sky had turned a dull gray again. The snow never truly stopped anymore, it simply paused between storms. Ethan pulled on his coat and stepped onto the porch. Atlas followed. The wind bit harder than usual that morning. The temperature had fallen well below 0 during the night. Ethan began clearing the path to the woodpile again, each shovel full heavier than the last. Atlas paced along the edge of the clearing, watching the silent forest. Halfway through the work, Ethan stopped. He leaned on the shovel, breathing slowly. Atlas returned and pressed against his side. "I'm fine," Ethan muttered. The dog remained there anyway. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Ethan added another log and sat down at the table. Atlas curled near the door. Hours passed quietly. No visitors came that day. The storm had grown too strong again. By evening, Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. He ignored it. The next morning brought clearer skies and more footsteps on the trail. A small group arrived near noon. Ethan gave them the last sack of potatoes from the bunker. Atlas watched silently as the bag left the cabin. After the visitors disappeared into the trees, Ethan climbed down into the bunker again. The room looked nearly empty now. A few sacks remained along the far wall. Beans, rice, flour. Ethan counted them slowly. 70 pounds. He rested his hand against the cold earth. Atlas sat beside him. The dog leaned his head against Ethan's arm. "Not much left," Ethan said quietly. Atlas stayed close. They climbed back into the cabin together. The afternoon passed slowly. Ethan split wood until his arms felt heavy. Atlas carried smaller pieces to the porch. But the weakness kept growing. By sunset, Ethan's legs felt unsteady. He tried to ignore it. After all, winter wasn't finished yet. The fire crackled softly inside the stove. Atlas lay beside the chair as Ethan stared into the flames. The room felt warmer than usual. Too warm. Ethan stood and took a step toward the door. The floor tilted beneath him. His hand reached for the table. Missed. The chair scraped loudly against the boards as he fell. Atlas jumped to his feet. The dog rushed to Ethan's side, whining softly. Ethan tried to sit up. His strength refused. The world blurred at the edges. Atlas nudged his shoulder with his nose. Ethan forced a weak smile. "Guess I should have eaten," he whispered. The dog barked once. Sharp, urgent. Ethan reached for Atlas's collar. "Stay," he murmured. But Atlas didn't stay. The dog ran to the door and scratched at it frantically. Then he barked again, louder this time. Ethan's vision faded. The last thing he saw was Atlas bursting through the cabin door and disappearing into the storm. The dog ran down the buried trail toward the valley. Through wind, through snow, through the freezing dark. Atlas had only one mission now: find help. Because the man who had fed the entire valley was lying alone on the cabin floor. And winter was still far from over. Atlas ran. The wind tore through the forest, whipping snow across the trail until the path nearly disappeared. But the German shepherd didn't hesitate. He knew the way down the mountain better than any man in Red Hollow. Ethan had walked this trail with him hundreds of times. Now Atlas ran it alone. His paws punched through crusted snow. The cold bit into the pads of his feet, but he kept moving, guided by memory and instinct. Trees blurred past as the dog raced through the frozen wilderness. Below the ridge, the faint glow of lights flickered through the storm. Red Hollow. Atlas barked as he burst from the tree line at the edge of town. A few men working beside a barn looked up in surprise. "Hey, that's Ethan's dog," one of them said. Atlas ran straight toward them, barking again, short, urgent bursts that echoed through the snowy air. The men exchanged uneasy glances. "Something's wrong," another muttered. Atlas turned and ran a few yards back toward the mountain trail, then stopped and barked again. He was calling them. Calvin Mercer stepped forward from the group. The rancher stared at the dog for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Get your coats," Mercer said. "We're going up the mountain." Within minutes, 4 men followed Atlas into the storm. The climb took hours. The wind had grown stronger, and the snow swallowed their footsteps almost immediately. But Atlas never slowed. Every few yards, he stopped to make sure the men were still behind him. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, a pale light still glowed in the window. Mercer pushed the door open. Ethan lay on the floor beside the table. Atlas rushed inside first, whining softly as he pressed against Ethan's shoulder. "He's breathing," Mercer said quickly, kneeling beside him. Another man added wood to the stove. Someone else poured hot water into a cup. They lifted Ethan carefully onto the bed. The veteran's face looked pale beneath his beard, his skin cold from hours on the cabin floor. Atlas stayed beside him, refusing to leave. For 2 days, Ethan drifted between sleep and half-consciousness. The storm outside slowly weakened. By the 3rd morning, the sky finally cleared. Sunlight spilled across the snow-covered mountains. Ethan opened his eyes.
Atlas lifted his head instantly. The dog's tail thumped softly against the wooden floor. Mercer sat in a chair beside the stove.
"You scared the hell out of your dog," the rancher said quietly. Ethan tried to sit up. Mercer shook his head. "Easy." Ethan's voice came out rough. "How long?" "2 days." Ethan looked toward the center of the cabin floor. The trap door remained closed. Atlas followed his gaze. Then the dog stood and walked toward the door. He began scratching. Mercer frowned. "What's he doing?" Atlas barked once. Then he ran outside. Ethan frowned weakly. "That dog doesn't bark for nothing." Mercer helped him to the doorway. Atlas stood near the old barn behind the cabin. The dog pawed at the snow beside the structure, digging furiously. Snow flew behind him as his paws tore into the frozen ground. "What's he after?" Mercer asked. Ethan walked slowly toward the barn. Atlas had already dug a hole nearly 2 feet deep. Suddenly, the dog's claws struck something solid. Thunk! Atlas barked loudly. Mercer knelt down and brushed away more snow. Wood. Old boards buried beneath the ground. The men looked at each other. Ethan grabbed a shovel leaning against the barn wall. Within minutes, they cleared the rest of the snow. A square wooden hatch appeared beneath the surface. Weathered, forgotten. Mercer pried it open. Cold air rushed upward from the darkness below. The men stared down into the hidden chamber. Wooden shelves lined the underground room. Sacks, boxes, metal cans stacked carefully along the walls. Old, but sealed tight against the cold. Mercer climbed down the ladder first. A moment later, his voice echoed upward. "Good Lord." Ethan leaned against the edge of the hatch. "What is it?" Mercer looked up. "Food." He brushed dust off one of the sacks. "Grain, dried beans, canned vegetables." More men climbed down to inspect the rest. The underground cellar stretched farther beneath the barn than anyone expected. Dozens of supplies filled the space. The previous landowner must have built it generations ago. A survival cellar meant for winters long forgotten. Until now. Mercer looked up at Ethan again. "There's enough here to feed the whole valley." Ethan sat down slowly on the edge of the hatch. Atlas climbed out of the cellar and stood beside him. The dog leaned his head gently against Ethan's arm. Ethan let out a quiet breath. "All this time," he murmured. Mercer shook his head with a faint smile. "You saved everyone with that bunker under your floor." He looked down into the hidden cellar again. "But this dog, he just saved the rest of winter." Atlas wagged his tail slowly as the men began hauling the first sacks into the sunlight. And for the first time in months, hope returned to the frozen valley of Red Hollow. The discovery beneath the old barn spread through the valley faster than any rumor had all winter. By the next morning, men and women from Red Hollow were climbing the mountain trail again, not with empty hands this time, but with sleds, ropes, and tools. The storm clouds had finally begun to break apart over the Wind River Range. Pale winter sunlight washed across the ridges, making the deep snow shimmer like glass. Ethan stood outside the cabin wrapped in a heavy coat Mercer had brought from town. Atlas remained beside him, alert but calm, watching the slow procession of neighbors arriving at the clearing. For months they had come one by one, hungry, ashamed, afraid. Now they arrived together, working, hauling sacks from the hidden cellar beneath the barn and loading them onto wooden sleds that could be pulled safely down the mountain trail.
The food inside the cellar was old but preserved well by the cold mountain earth. Beans, cornmeal, flour sealed in metal tins, rows of canned vegetables packed decades earlier by hands long gone. Someone had built the cellar for a winter just like this one, and then time had buried it, until Atlas found it. Calvin Mercer stepped up beside Ethan, brushing snow from his gloves.
"We counted everything this morning," he said. Ethan glanced toward the barn. Men were carrying another crate up from the underground ladder. "How much?" Mercer shook his head slowly. "More than any of us guessed." He let out a quiet breath. "Enough to feed the valley until spring." Ethan said nothing for a moment. Atlas sat at his side, ears lifting whenever another sled creaked across the clearing. "You were right," Mercer said finally. "About winter." Ethan looked toward the distant mountains. They stood silent and immense beneath the pale sky. "I wasn't right," Ethan replied. "I was just scared." Mercer studied him. "That bunker you built under your floor saved half this town." Ethan shook his head gently. "And the other half got saved by a dog." Atlas looked up when he heard his name. His tail thumped once against the snow. Down in the valley, the people of Red Hollow began organizing the supplies carefully. The food from the hidden cellar would be stored in the old town hall, rationed equally among every family. For the first time in months, the children of the valley would go to bed with full stomachs again. Winter still held the mountains in its grip, but the fear had begun to loosen. Days passed. The storms grew weaker. The sun climbed a little higher each morning. Snow still covered everything, but small, dark patches of earth began appearing along the south-facing slopes. One afternoon near the end of March, Ethan walked slowly down the ridge toward the barn. Atlas trotted ahead, leaving a trail of paw prints in the softening snow. The old hatch remained open now. Men had reinforced the underground cellar and repaired the broken shelves inside. They had even begun building a larger root cellar beside the barn, something that would serve the valley for generations. Mercer believed every mountain town needed one. "Lesson learned," the rancher had said. Ethan stood beside the open hatch and looked down into the cellar. The shelves were still half full. "Enough. For now." Atlas nudged his hand gently. Ethan smiled faintly. "You knew it was there, didn't you?" The dog tilted his head. Maybe he had smelled it beneath the snow. Maybe he had simply trusted the mountain in ways people no longer remembered how to do. Either way, Atlas had led them to it. Weeks later, the first true sign of spring arrived. Water began trickling beneath the snowbanks. Birdsong returned to the trees along the valley floor. The long winter finally started to release its grip. One warm afternoon, Ethan sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sun settle behind the Wind River peaks. Atlas stretched out beside him. The dog had aged during the hard winter, but his eyes still carried the same steady loyalty they always had. Down in Red Hollow, children were playing in the melting snow. Smoke rose peacefully from the chimneys of homes that had nearly gone dark forever. A young boy visiting the cabin stood near the porch railing, staring curiously at the wooden trapdoor in the middle of the floor. "That where the food was?" he asked. Ethan nodded. The boy frowned thoughtfully. "How much food should a person keep?" he asked. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Atlas rested his head across the veteran's boots. For a moment, Ethan watched the mountains. Then he answered. "Always store enough," he said quietly, "for the people you haven't met yet." The boy nodded slowly as if trying to understand. The sun slipped lower behind the mountains. Golden light spread across the snow-covered valley. Atlas closed his eyes beside Ethan. And for the first time since the storms began, the mountains of Wyoming felt peaceful again. Some winters test the strength of your house. Others test the strength of your heart. Ethan Brooks survived because he prepared. Red Hollow survived because someone chose to share. And sometimes, the one who saves everyone walks on 4 legs. If this story meant something to you, I want to ask you for one small thing. Down in the comments, just type 1 if you believe loyalty like Atlas showed still exists in this world. Or type 0 if you think people have forgotten what it means to stand by someone when times get hard. It's a simple comment, but I read every single one of them. And if stories about courage, loyalty, and the quiet heroes of the mountains speak to you, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because there are many more stories waiting to be told. Stories about veterans, stories about dogs who never give up on their people, and stories that remind us that even in the harshest winter, kindness can keep a whole town alive. So subscribe, stay with us, and I'll see you in the next story.